Hey gang, welcome to Ozone Late Night. This is a fun one. I am talking to somebody that I haven't spoken to in 20 years. My old friend from college, Dr. Doug Bielmeier, who is a professor, a musician, and a fellow creative, and we are going to be talking about a lot of fun stuff. It is a wonderful discussion, and I do want to point out that Doug's new album, or upcoming album, I should say, Music for Billionaires, is now available for pre-order pretty much, as far as I can tell, everywhere. So go look for it. He was very nice enough to let me hear it ahead of time. And if you're into ambient music, it is fantastic. Again, Music for Billionaires, available to pre-order now. This is a fun show, so I can't wait for you to hear it. Let's get right to it. Okay, everybody, welcome to another installment of Ozone Late Night. Joining me for this episode is Dr. I love it,
yeah.
Doug Bielmeier, Associate Teaching Professor at the Northeastern University College of Arts, Media, and Design. Doug is also a drone and experimental electronic musician, and you can find more information on his background, album releases, and podcast, which is worth listening to, because it's a lot like this, except way better done, at DougBielmeier.com. Whatever. I will have the link in the show notes. DougBielmeier.com. Yeah, I got that far, and that's a miracle. Doug, welcome to Ozone Late Night. How you doing, man?
Thanks for having me. Joe. It's been a while. It's been a long time.
It's been 20-something years. Got it right? It's around there.
Do your listeners know that we used to sleep in the same bedroom?
No.
Do they know that? It
no,
sounds creepy when you say it that way, right?
No, it sounds great when you say it that way. No, there's a whole backstory to this episode happening at all. And I did a bit of it on our regular show. Because I sent your album to Lando, who you remember from college, who I've done my show with for 17, 18, whatever, how many years it's been. Yeah. And I didn't tell him it was yours. I said, here's something you might write, you want to write to, because he's always asking me for ambient albums to write to. I said, write to this. Right. This is probably good.
Yeah.
And then I waited a couple days. I'm like, yeah, how'd you like the album? He's like, it's pretty good. And I'm like, yeah, Doug did that album. He's like, Doug who? I'm like, fucking Doug from college did that. Yeah. And then we did a whole bit on the show. So for everybody else, this is how this came about, because this is one of those universal string whatever things, depending on what you believe in.
Yeah.
There's a guy I'm going to be doing an interview with in 2 or 3 days who is a musician as well, and he does. The one track I listen to of is kind of a more electronic tracks, sort of along the lines of what you do, Doug, but with vocals.
Sure.
But then his other albums are more what I guess you would call alternative, or at least what we used to call it. I don't know what kids call it now, but whatever, because we're old.
Yeah. Who knows what they call it?
Yeah, I don't know.
TikTok or something. I don't know.
Sure, it's a TikTok album. It could be.
It's a TikTok album.
So I'm listening to it, and I'm like, man, this reminds me of something I haven't listened to in a long time, which is a band called Catherine Wheel.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure you're the one who brought them. Right? You like that band, right?
I think, yeah, I did. And I remember you knew a song that I didn't. And it was it was like from their first album. It was what's it? Not Show Me, Tell Me. What is the?
I Want to Touch You is a second album one, I think.
Yeah. But that was the one. I didn't know that track. I only knew Chrome, which was like the Blue album that had.
Right. The Dancers Underwater or whatever.
Yeah. It had Crank, which was, I think that was like their biggest hit in the U.S. was Crank on the Chrome album. But yeah, you knew other stuff. Like I feel like you knew the earlier stuff, and of course that was in the days of like MP3 sharing and
Napster, man. Remember Napster? We had constant T1 Napster. We were talking, Lando and I were talking about how much stuff I was pulling down.
Yeah, because that was even before LimeWire. So that was like Napster. That was like
Audio Galaxy, all that stuff was back then.
Yeah, and Winamp. Do you remember Winamp? And Winamp skins.
Winamp is still around. Yeah. People are still using it. Yes, it's still around, and people still use it, which is insane, but it is still around. So I went back and I listened to that song. I'm like, holy shit, this song holds the fuck up. Because I literally had probably not listened to that song in at least 15 years. It just kind of slipped out of my mind.
Right.
And I went, man, and I remember there was a band you liked, and they had a license. It was like a Colorado replacement.
The samples.
That's samples.
Yes.
That's what it was. And I'm like, shit, man. I wonder how Doug's doing, because I haven't. We looked you up, me and Lando, a while ago, because we were talking about college something, and but you didn't have the website, or I don't remember any of that stuff. At least not the way it is now. And I went and I looked, I'm like, holy shit, man. He's releasing albums that are ambient albums, because I love ambient music. He's interviewing experimental artists, which I love experimental music. I'm not going to necessarily say that I listen to it all the time, but I love the idea of how people, like what you get into, the idea of how people create these soundscapes and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm like, shit, man, why don't I just, in that email I sent you, what's funny about that email is it's written as I'm thinking it. Like, I was thinking in this unhinged state where I'm like, holy fuck, he does a podcast. He's got a fucking website. I'm going to get him.
It is weird. It is weird that we both do podcasts and
And the late night series is focused mostly on creative people. I bring people on, filmmakers, sculptors, that type of thing. And I'm like, explain to me how, because everything that I don't do is mysticism to me. It is, even though creative processes are largely in some ways the same. They're not when they're not what you do. So I'm like, how does somebody write music? I don't understand. How do you sculpt something and not want to just destroy it? Which maybe they do, but so.
Well, no, that's really interesting, because when you sent that email to me, my initial response was like, abso-fucking-lutely. Like, I just wanted to respond with one word, because we hadn't talked in so long. I wanted to respond with one word, and I'm like, well, I don't know where Joe's at in his life right now, so maybe an abso-fucking-lutely is not the best.
Oh no, that would have been
that's
perfect.
Not the best response, but it sounds like that might have been the sweet spot. So I think I just said, like, absolutely, like, let's do it, because I knew it would be fun. I knew it would be fun to catch up, and you still, doing art, being part of that and part of the creative process. I was like, oh, it'd be great to catch up, but it'd also be great to just talk to another artist. So.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And I was the same way, because when I looked at your website, I'm like, okay, I have to make sure that he's not secretly a Nazi. Like, you have to do all this stuff now, which is, it's insane that this is the world we live in. Because we knew each other and we were tight for a short amount of time, but you don't know what happens in that huge span. Yeah. So. Yeah, I'm like, man, I hope he's not some, apologize for politics, alt-right nutbag is going to tell me that he believes that the wall
like a
was
prepper or something, like live up in the woods and
Well, hey,
make my own jerky. And...
I sort of get, man, up to a point. As long as you're not crossing into Unabomber territory, I'm like, yeah, I get that. You want to get away from.
And I think making your own jerky, that's respectable. Sure. You got to watch the salt, because of the blood pressure and all. But I think it's respectable making your own jerky.
Yeah, up in the woods, there's deer, there's bugs, and at the last process I just listened to it, where the guy's like, oh yeah, we don't have fireflies in California, which they don't. There is there's no fireflies. They don't get electrical storms.
Right.
They have slanted parking spaces. It's weird.
Yeah, I was just interviewing somebody on the process, and he talked about the first time he was from California, and he went to Vermont for the first time, and he saw fireflies, and he was like, it was so inspiring me to create this piece of music. And I was just like, fireflies? I'm like, I can see those every, on a Tuesday. But it's just strange how like different regions, like they just, we have different stuff, different things.
Yeah, it's so. Because people think of the United States as like a big cut, like everybody. It's like, no, number one, the accents give away that that's not the case. But it's all this, because you still call soda pop, I assume, right?
No, because
you stopped.
See what happened is I went to college, and a bunch of jerks made fun of me and ridiculed me for saying pop. So now I just say soda. When I'm like trying to shine somebody on, I say pop. But yeah, no, soda. It's soda now. You guys ruined me. You stole my innocence. You all stole my innocence. In Connecticut.
There were lots of instances of stealing innocence in Connecticut, many of which we're not going to get into. So once Doug got back to me, and I'm like, all right, we have to do this because it's been so long, and so much of our stuff in terms of how we do our shows crosses over. And I listened to your album, the upcoming album, which is, you said September release for Music for Billionaires, correct?
No, it's coming out Friday the 13th of October.
October.
So October, Friday the 13th.
So I will know.
I think it was supposed to be on the 6th originally, but they changed it to the 13th. So
got it.
It's kind of a weird haunted vibe, I guess now. I don't know, to the album.
But I remember from college, and I've often said that college was a terrible career decision. But one of the great things that it did was, and I honestly have said, and I really didn't have this appreciation at the time because I was much younger and much stupider. But I think that in a world full of a lot of intolerance and hatred and everything else, getting to be around people who were so wildly different from me, I wouldn't recommend it as far as a career decision, but as a life thing, I am really grateful that I got to be around such a, I mean, the word's overused now, but a diverse group of people. I mean, there were so many different people just in our floor the year I was there.
Yeah. You know, and my big thing was too, is like being around, that's the first time I had been around artists. So I had been around musicians, but being around just, painters or, illustrators or graphic designers, and just like seeing that there's these people that you didn't think you really had anything in common with, or didn't really know how you like fit into somebody who like makes a sculpture. You're like, what does that have to do with music? But like just the idea that like the creative process and like the struggles and just the, we were even talking earlier about being like, why am I doing this? And like going through these like spells of like giving up and like, coming, just like coming in and out of sort of like productivity and struggle, like just being around those type of people, and just seeing that it's like, wow, like even in these other creative, areas, we're all dealing with the same shit.
Yeah, and I remember vividly when you were working on compositions, that type of thing, and some of our musical tastes crossed over, some of it didn't. But yeah. I mean, I think I remember because Aphex Twin.
You introduced me to Aphex Twin. So, talking about my previous album, Ambient Works, it's obviously a ripoff of, Richard T. James, Ambient Works Volume 1 and 2. Like, I mean, not musically, not like copyright, like, but definitely this idea that you would make a collection of, sort of these ambient songs and put it on an album. And, I think that's something we used to like when we were like, trying to fall asleep or something like that, or like later at night, that's something that's an album that would go on.
Yep.
And it was, see, the thing about it was ambient music, right? It's definitely like chill music. It's relaxation music. It's repetitive, but there's really just something to it. And there was this real credibility, I think, to everything he does, from like Window Liquor to all the other projects he's worked on. There's always this like real integrity to whatever he did. So sometimes it was silly. Sometimes it was kind of cheeky. Sometimes it was, just like this like heavy, like Come to Daddy. That's just like, it's like a screaming.
Oh, yeah.
But there was always this like other credibility that he brought that I think, Brian Eno has that, I think, with his ambient music, and, some of the stuff that Bowie did, and, Trent Reznor, like they always had this like other artistic side to him. But yeah, you straight up, if anybody ever asks, I'm like, who introduced me to Aphex Twin, it would definitely be you.
Yeah, I remember I was listening to, like, Ventolin is a very hard song to listen to, but the idea is that it's the expression of an asthma attack. And once you have that in mind, that makes sense. And that's one of those things where there are things where people are like, how could you listen to it? I'm like, look, it's not like I'm really necessarily enjoying it. It is harsh because it's meant to be harsh. The message is, this is the panic, the pain, the stress of this panic, of this asthma attack. And that's why I like it. Not because I think it's, a fun tune to whistle.
And maybe that's what I meant by credibility. Like, maybe credibility is the wrong word, but it's like he would just try stuff. He would be like, what if I wrote a song about an asthma attack? Like, what if what if this song is about these tones, or like this vibe, or this thing? Like, he would just do stuff like that. And I feel like, I talk about doing experimental music, and people are like, what is experimental music? Is it just like music that people aren't interested in listening to or buying? And I think that's part of what experimental music is, not the buying thing, but this idea that like you're trying stuff out, you're doing, it's still a piece of music, it's still a piece of art, but you're saying, what if I did this with one arm behind my back, or what if I tried to express this thing in an abstract way or not abstract way? And I think that's one of the things, that I definitely took away from Aphex Twin, by all the cool stuff and just like the really great synths and sounds, and that like jungle, drum, kind of the amen break that he often is using, and a lot of artists at that time are using. But just this like, let's try something, and it may be uncomfortable and it may turn off, people might skip that track, but he's just kind of dedicated to seeing an idea through.
Yeah, he dumped a bunch of stuff onto SoundCloud. I'm going to say now it's probably 10 years ago, and some of it was literally just what clearly to him were sketches. They were not going to ever be completed things. But there has always been, and one of the things that I love most about him as a creator is, like you said, there is clearly an intent. There is a...
Yeah.
It's not just I'm pressing keys randomly or I'm dropping marbles onto a keyboard. And I want to see what, because I know there are people who do that kind of stuff and they call it experimental. And hey, that it can turn out really good. But that to me, he's always been, because I know you're kind of back and forth on the word composer. I know you have some artistic struggle with that, which I'll have you explain in a minute. But he always feels like he is composing the pieces and that there is some kind of, I don't know if structure is the right word for it, but there is definitely a logic, a sense of what he's trying to convey.
I think I agree with that 100%. And I think he's trying it out. He's trying it out. Like, I mean, I feel like Aphex Twin or Richard T. James's like sketches are probably like, they're probably awesome. You know what I mean? Like, like somebody's throwaways, his throwaways are probably really, great ideas. Maybe they're not developed all the way or something. But, so yeah, I love that idea that he's experimenting, he's trying things out. I don't know. I always relate it to like TV and film too. I think so many shows now with like Netflix and like all these different companies that have all these different shows, there's like a lot of content out there to watch and to consume. And, really regardless of what the show is now, like I'll watch anything. Like I don't care if it's like a sci-fi thing, if it's like it's supposed to be like a rom-com, like I don't know, like it's like not written for me. But I find the shows and the content I'm drawn to is where decisions are being made, and even if I disagree with them, I'm like, no, you know what? The writers are making these specific decisions about this. They're manipulating me in a way I don't agree with it. Maybe I don't like it, but I'm like, there's this decision making. And, Aphex Twin has always had that. A lot of, I think a lot of the electronic artists from like the 90s and 2000s that we used to listen to all the time, it was really clear, like some of them, like some of the trance artists, it felt like, it was just like this thing and this like machine kind of running. And then there were the other, artists like Paul Oakenfold and stuff like that, where it was like, oh yeah, like it's trance and there's this like repetitive nature to it, but there's this like decision making happening. And you might not like where it's going. You might not like the drop or like the tone of the synth, but it just feels intentional. And that's not to say all music or all art has to be like intentional, but I'm really drawn to that, I found. And I think that's universal, whether you're listening to like trance, like drum and bass, or like, I don't know, like yodeling music or something. I don't know, like if there's this intentionality to it, I think that's really attractive.
Well, it's interesting too, because you say that, and then in experimental music, there can be, well, I'm not going to say there's no structure because that wouldn't be correct, or at least I don't know if that's correct, but it can come across to some people as unstructured. Now that's still a decision to make it that way. But like you said, it's tough to explain it. How do you explain what experimental music is to people in terms of, they say, well, it's just somebody who's clanging, pots together. I don't know what this is.
But that's not my thing. So when I say experimental music, that is a thing. That is a whole thing of music where somebody is going to go in with like 5 pots and they're going to do something very abstract. They're going to do something very improvisatory. And that's music. I accept that. That's music. That's art. That's a thing. But that's not my bag. And so instead of saying like, that's not music, or I hate it, or I don't like it, or get it out of my face, I'm more drawn to this other thing, like that's the way I try to do it, because I feel like it's like we're all on the same boat. And as artists, as musicians, as, illustrators, as whatever, sculptors, anybody who's doing something, writers, anybody who's doing something creative, we're really all on the same ship. And I'm just always so hesitant to really be like, that was bad. Like, why did you do that? Like, like what's wrong with you? Like, and it's tough sometimes, because sometimes you like listen to stuff and you're like, no, absolutely not. Nope. And that's, that's your initial response. And so I think that's tough. I think it's tough to, have this really visceral dislike of something and then not just go in and follow your instinct and just be like, forget this. Like, I can't do anything with this. And that's not to say that I'll try to sit and be like, no, I'm just not hearing it yet. Like if I sit here, like the Zen philosophy, like if I sit here long enough, the trees will talk to me.
Eventually I will hear what is meant to be heard. It will come to me.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes I'm like, yeah, no, it's somebody like, dicking around with 4 pots. So, like, and they didn't really plan it out. So maybe enjoy some of the timbres and kind of just some of the musicianship that comes through. But at the same time, like, maybe not take it seriously is the right word, but maybe I don't try to analyze it as much as something where I know the person sat down and like a George R. R. Martin book where, it's like revision after revision. And like, I know this dialogue went through like, 17 to 30 revisions just to get it right, to have it, the timing just to be right, and not to say one's better than the other, it's just different. And then I kind of have to like change my listening perspective and my expectations, but it's tough, man, when it gets really experimental, when it gets like really crazy, sometimes there's not much to hang on to.
Well, and it's funny too that you say this, because this is, it really just is such a interesting thing to think about. Because again, we haven't spoken in a long time, completely different lives, different coasts, the whole thing. But I'm in the same kind of, I used to be much more of this movie, because for me, it's more a film. I do a lot of film reviews. And I used to just be like, this movie sucks. Don't watch it. I would just like throw everything out. And now I'm at a point where I'm like, look, if you enjoy it, that's great. I can't see but I am very rarely ever doing a review where I say this movie is terrible, don't watch it. And it's usually when I feel like the person making it, and this goes back to your point about Aphex Twin, is doing so from a cynical or a very, I don't care about the audience way. And so you can tell that, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. Is it the, like, so I just watched, what was it? Salvador by Oliver Stone. And it was a movie from the 80s. It is a horrible movie, but it's beautiful. It's beautiful. But just the situation, James Wood, it's like classic James Woods, not vampires James Woods, but, classic like James Woods, just being that guy, that guy that just won't shut up, that keeps asking for money, throws people under the bus all the time. It's just is a cockroach, right? So it's horrible to watch. It's a horrible movie to watch, but it's fantastic. And it really talks about that whole, kind of socio-political just situation that was happening at the time in the late 70s in El Salvador, and just like how the U.S. government dealt with it and all this and that. And today, in today's society, it's like, let's talk bad about the government. Like, it's a Tuesday, let's do it. But like in, the late 70s, early 80s, it was like, wow, he's really going at the government here. Like that's kind of subversive, and so I don't know. So even though I like disagreed with the character and just him as a person and just like some of the takes, I was like, this was all intentional and it was meant to manipulate me, entertain me, guide me in a certain direction, change my perspective. And so even though like you can be like, this was horrible to sit through, like, wow, man, like there was a lot of thought that went into that.
Yeah, that has become kind of because I tend now to review lesser films because there's so much written about all the giant movies that come out,
right?
And I'm not going to be able to add much to that, that somebody else hasn't said. So I'll go back and watch a movie from 1983 that an Italian guy ripped off RoboCop, and it's made for $20. And one of my things is, and Lando has now said this, and I didn't really pick up that I was doing. He's like, you are trying to create a beneficial backstory for what's going on here. Like, you're trying to put a and I'm like, you know what, I am, because I don't like to think that people just make stuff for empty, vacuous reasons. I have to think that people make stuff with aiming for the best they can make with what they've gotten. Just because somebody only had $50,000 and not $50 million. See, that's where I get irritated. When somebody has $50 million and they make something that is cynical and with no artistic merit that you can take, and then some other guy just can't make the movie he wants to make because he doesn't have the budget, but he's trying. I'm going to back that movie 100 times and tell people about it before I will the other one, because again, the other one has a platform and I'm not sure it deserves it, but I don't want to spend my time slamming it either. So I'll just try to elevate stuff that nobody's heard of and say, go watch this. It's worth seeing.
Well, especially because there's such a rich history of the original being this really standout low budget film, like, like El Mariachi or what's La Femme Nikita, like
Halloween.
Point of No, yeah, like all these things that were these like small, talk about John Carpenter, right? But like all these small things on these small budgets that it's just a great idea. We watched, a few months ago, we watched the movie Prime again. Do you remember that one?
Oh, yes,
with the engineers and time travel.
Yes, the time travel one where you have to have a spreadsheet but it's a great movie. I couldn't follow it without literally a piece of paper, but it's a great movie.
Right. Yeah. And by like 3/4 the way through, I'm like, I have
Primer.
Primer. Yeah. Primer. Yeah. I have no, 3/4 of the way through the movie, I have no idea what's going on anymore. But yeah, even that movie where there was like scenes where there was like audio dropout where you're like, did you not catch that dialogue? Like, there were like production issues, but this idea of the storytelling and, regardless of the budget, I mean, that's not to say that you should just, do stuff as cheaply as possible. And
no, but what you're talking about is it's very clear that it wasn't laziness. It was probably that they ran out of time or didn't have the person with the knowledge. But the movie holds up, and you can tell that there is a very sincere attempt to make this story work. And I agree with you. If somebody's got bad audio, or you see a boom mic, I don't care, man. If the movie's, if I feel like the filmmakers were trying, then I really don't. I'm not going to care if I notice that there's somebody's hand in the frame or that there's a modern car in the background. All that stuff is, that's for nitpickers. That's fine. That's YouTube basically is nitpick central. That's why I don't do YouTube channels like that. But I would rather celebrate the fact that an artist is trying to make what they're trying to make, and I feel like that's part of what you do with the process. Is okay. What is the thinking and the when you were talking in the most recent one where he was the Fireflies thing is a perfect example. Something because to somebody who grows up around those things, it doesn't seem like anything.
Right.
But in the absence of it, those things become remarkable. And that can lead to this expression of an idea from something that most people just look at and keep walking because, oh yeah, Fireflies, I've grown up with my whole life. There's nothing special about that. Well, there is. You just don't see it because the perspective shift has to happen. And that's that type of thing I look for now in everything, where I'm like, oh, if there's some kind of actual intent behind it, I'm interested. I may not ever watch it again, but I'm going to talk about it and say this is why I think there's value in it, even if it's not entirely successful.
Yeah. The flip of that, though, is kind of what Music for Billionaires, the new album coming out, part of the
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm terrible about setting this up.
No. But I think we're sliding right into it because I think the flip of that is, we're talking about the budget and, a lot of these films, didn't quite have the budget and we don't think it's laziness. It's just, the just money alone, how much, these productions cost. And, kind of the idea of Music for Billionaires, the satirical kind of title is it's supposed to be like Brian Eno, like music from, music for airports.
Right.
Like it's the same idea, like Music for Billionaires, because, one of the things, so this is my 4th album now. And, these cost a lot of money to make, and not just money, but like time and coordination. And, on this one, I worked with 2 different ensembles, the Unheard of Ensemble, as well as Hypercube. And they're both in New York. So I had to like travel and we had to have studio sessions and I had to arrange sessions. And then let's not talk about editing. I don't want to talk about editing. I was editing for like ever. But like, so all this time, and the money is important too, right? Like that's kind of what we're talking about with these movies, right? Like it's like maybe they don't always have the budget, but things have to be finished and there's deadlines and things have to be put out. So, part of this like Music for Billionaires, it's like, well, who really has the time, money to actually create? We were talking about your illustrations too. And like, you just like kept doing them, but you just naturally, you like take breaks and all this and that. But just that time, like how, when you sit down to write, or to draw, what is that? Is that an hour? Is that 2 hours? And then like in your day, like, how does that fit into your day? Like, I'd be interested, like, what's the time, like, how much time each day are you spending doing illustrations?
Well, this is funny because I do want to get into this and how your album was made because I'm always fascinated by the same thing. But for me, basically, I'll tell you today. So today, because I knew we were doing this show. So first thing I did was got up early. I went, there's a there's a nice little kind of what the hell do you call it? Like a little shopping center. It has this really nice area where you can sit. Went out there, got my coffee, had my iPad because I do everything on an iPad now. That way I can make mistakes and it doesn't screw anything up.
A little edit undo. Never.
Oh man, that thing is such a lifesaver. It's unbelievable. So I sat there and I'm drinking my coffee, and I usually work for, and I do this on my streams too. When I do art streams, I generally tell people you should stop, depending on what your process is, but I keep using process. Go listen to this podcast. Process, promotion, marketing, hype, whatever.
Plug.
So I find that after about an hour to 90 minutes, I need to stop looking at what I'm doing because I will become too wrapped up in it, and I won't be able to. The mistakes become amplified, and they also become covered up. So what I'll do is about an hour. And the nice part is the iPad starts to heat up. So there's a natural kind of, I'm like, oh, the screen's getting hot. So even if I haven't paid attention, I look at my watch, I'm like, oh yeah, it's been about 45 to 90 minutes. And so I'll be like, okay, stop, close the iPad, put it aside, look at something else, trees, birds, whatever, for a good 15 to 20 minutes. And then at that point I make a decision. Okay, do I want to keep going or do I want to save this for later? Because I know how my mind is, and I will overwork something and destroy it if I spend too much time on it. So that, for me, that's about the right amount of time. It's an hour to 90 minutes per thing when there's no deadlines involved, which is usually not the case with me. But
right.
I mean, is that the same when you're doing stuff?
No, I love that story. You know why I love that story? Because it involved coffee, first of all. But second of all, I love that story because it sounded like you got up early, and the first thing you did, and this is what I do, that's why I love this story, is like the first thing I do, I try to get up early or have the first thing I do be that creative task, that thing that I really want to do. And some days, you know what, some days, man, that's like editing because I have to like go through, hours of recordings and like edit it to get it to the shape that I want. But I do that first. And you know why I really love that? Because, there I am sitting. So, maybe I'll go grab a cup of coffee and then come back to the studio, or maybe I'll go in early to the school and work in the studio there. But the idea is if I do that for the first hour of my day, and I'm usually only working like an hour and a half. I'm not pulling like all-nighters where I'm working like around the clock. I'm doing it in those like first few hours of the day. And then I find like every other pointless, useless fucking thing I have to do for the rest of the day, like all the just like a bullshit, like responding to an email about like telling somebody to go, F themselves without really telling them that because you want to keep your job, but like all the other bullshit that you have to do the day, I feel like I'm just more willing to put up with it, and I'm more willing to do it because at the start of the day, I took care of my business. Like
you're creatively ahead. You've moved ahead creatively, and that's why I'm getting up.
That's why I'm getting up. I'm not getting up to like go and earn a paycheck. Like I need to go and earn a paycheck, but I'm getting up to be creative, and I'm here to be creative. And I mean that sounds like magical and like unicorns and rainbows, but like that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm on a podcast. That's why I have my own podcast, is I want to be creative and I want to be around creative people. And so I find on days when I don't get that hour, when I don't get that morning routine, the rest of the day, I'm just a little bit shorter with people. I'm just like a little bit, I'm already at a 7, like out of 10, 10 is like meltdown. And I'm like sitting at a 7, but if I'm creative, if I get my work done, if I do a good job, that's like the blue collar work ethic I think I have. Like, it's like, I did my job today,
Yeah, that's one of the things in my, and I don't think I did this right away, but I've really tried to be consistent with it, is when I do my art streams at the very end, I'm like, go do something creative or explore something creative, because it's good for you. It's good for your mind. It's good for your body. It's good for everything.
Absolutely.
And I've kind of adopted now the Bob Ross mentality. Like, even if you draw something and it's crap, who cares? It's still something as a break, as a way to let your mind kind of wander. And I think that is, I am becoming a hippie as I'm getting older, which is apparently converse of what happens. They say you get conservative. I am turning into George Carlin more and more. Yeah. And I'm like,
well, but think about that though. Do you believe though, even those quote unquote shitty drawings or those like disasters, like, don't you feel like that? Do you feel like those come back to you though, in those, when you finally have that drawing or that idea and you're like, oh, this is something? Do you feel like that's from the toil, the time you spent making the 10 bad sketches?
Yeah, that's why I like what I call squiggle drawings, where you literally take a pen, you just make a big blob, and then you make it into something. You create a monster. You do it with kids. You can do whatever. You can do it yourself. Yeah. And that, I feel like, no matter what it ends up with, because it almost never comes out as something you'd ever sell or anything like that, but there is a problem-solving and creative engine that is combined and fires, and that will benefit you later, whether you are aware of it or not. You know, you may not necessarily go into your next whatever, because I'm sure you're the same way. You probably, and you could tell me whether I'm correct or incorrect here, but you probably sit there and noodle on stuff, and you know it's not really going anywhere, but it's something to just kind of allow a creative space that's not related to a project or work necessarily, but just allows for essentially completely free-form creativity.
You know, and that's beautiful because, you know, one of the things, you know, I've been working so much on this album and getting it done. So I just like finished the like final mixes maybe a month or two ago, and they're off to get mastered. But, you know, so I was always like doing something for this like deadline for this project. And maybe about a week ago, I started just like kind of working around with this. Like, I'm like, no, let me go play around with my Juno. Like it's this nice little synth that I have. It's kind of like half broken. So I'm like, let me just like go and like, I'm going to spend an hour and I'm just going to mess around with it. And, you know, the sensible part of my brain was like, well, dude, you're just going to like waste an hour then. 'Cause you know, you're going to just, you know, be messing around. Well, sure enough, I like worked on something, and I mean, I'm about halfway through a string quartet now for this idea. And it was like, oh, it was so refreshing to just be like, there's no strings attached to this thing. Just go mess around for an hour. And sure enough, you know, like 4 hours later, I was like, hey, I've got to do other stuff today, you know, but, so it was just really nice. It's free to have like, it's really nice to have just like some free, like some play time, and not have it always be like, oh, you know, the agency needs this, you know, or the label needs this, or, you know, this client needs this, you know, from me by the end of the week. So I've got to, you know, budget my time. So that's been really refreshing. I've been doing a lot of work on live sets too. So like performing a lot of this stuff live using like the Push and just other like Ableton software to perform it live. And even that has just been like a breath of fresh air, because it's like I'm not sitting here trying to like tune a string part or like edit something or like, you know, try to get this volume fade just perfect on something. I'm just experimenting. And like I said, my interpretation of experimental music is that you're just testing a theory. And yeah, sometimes it's horrible. You're like, oh my God, I think my ears are broken. And other times you're like, this is the next thing.
But you know what's interesting about, and this is, I was going to say, one thing I like about musicians is when they release, and usually now it's on SoundCloud or something. And that's,
sure. Yeah.
I've been for years saying that the best thing about the internet is that it's given creators free license to put their stuff out there and someone will discover it. And one thing I love is when musicians put offcuts or undeveloped ideas, because I think that somebody else, and this goes back to the idea of the experimental thing, somebody who sits there and says, I've had this tune in my head, but nobody's making music like this. So it's obviously nobody's going to want this. They're going to hate it. Then you hear something where it's, okay, it's not what's on the album, but it's clear that this is a creative way that people are expressing themselves. And that person hears something similar and says, well, why don't I finish it? Why don't I just finish it and put it somewhere? And even if only 10 people say this is great, you've now reached 10 people. I don't care if it's 1 or 1 million. I mean, obviously 1 million will probably pay your bills, but the reality is that if you connect to somebody in an artistic way, you are a successful artist. I don't care whether you have 1,000 hits or 1. You have accomplished what most people want out of their creativity, which is to connect somebody to what you've produced in a unique way.
I think the win, if you're just like creating something and you're not like, you know, participating in like, I don't know, like substance abuse or like risky behavior or like gambling or like lying or like if you're just like, if for that hour you're doing something for yourself, which is a creative thing, I mean, you're successful. I mean, obviously, yeah, it would be great to win a Grammy. Like that might be the goal, but I don't know. You talked about that like morning routine, which sounded really beautiful to me, about this idea that you're like going and getting your cup of coffee, you got your routine, you did a drawing. I mean, what would your day be like? What would your days be like if you didn't do that?
Well, I think it's exactly what you said. Is I always feel like if I haven't done something creative, and it doesn't necessarily have to be drawing either. Creative expression could take many forms.
Creative could be, it could be a lot of things.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many avenues for it. That's what's so great about it. And there's so many tools now that people can use. This is another thing that's so different from when you and I were younger.
Yeah.
Especially when we were really young. There was, Photoshop was the only thing you could get for visuals. and it was $2,000 or whatever. Now there's free software that gets you 95% of what anybody would ever need out of Photoshop. I'm sure it's the same for musical tools. There's free stuff everywhere. I mean, there's $5 apps that you can use that get you started.
Do you remember the MIDI lab at the Hart School?
Oh yeah, I absolutely
when I was there.
remember.
Do you remember you came down? They had like fans down there because it was so hot because there was all these like big giant computers. But I guess I was doing some work on my computer in our dorm room, but if I had to do any heavy lifting, I had to do it there. And yeah, I mean, like, yeah, it's the future. Like, it's not the 90s anymore. But even just the idea now that with a laptop and a lap steel and like my push controller, I basically can go anywhere and do like high level, like AI interpretive, FFT analysis, like in real time, pretty much anywhere. And even just 20 years ago, I mean, we had to do it in this like specialized lab that literally was overheating because there were so many computers in it. So like so like this idea of I can be creative anywhere, because like think about it, you taking your desktop to the coffee shop so that you could, edit, undo, or, have the, just all the other tools that, the computer, brings to your artistic process. Like if you had to bring a desktop computer, you wouldn't,
or even the way I used to do it was on an 18 by 24 sketch pad. Well, there's no way I could carry that around and, erasers. You'd have a bag full of stuff that you'd be logging around. Whereas now I have an iPad and an Apple Pencil, and the entire suite of anything I would do on that physical pad, which I still do that to kind of maintain that muscle memory and do that stuff. I like to do that as well. But that is now something I can carry around in what looks like a magazine. It doesn't look like anything. I mean, it's nothing. And that's so much compute power. And then I can post that for people to look at immediately with high fidelity and or collaborate in some cases. Like when I was doing the magic cards, they were saying, "Can you send us, sketches?" And I would send it. Now, can you imagine trying to send a music track when we were in school and how much time that would have taken? And then,
well, I would have had to like burn a CD, I think, and mail it to them.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is revisions too, because I'm sure like when you're working, with these larger clients, you have revisions. They're like, great, we like this, but could this be, 5% redder, or
absolutely.
Can you change this? And so if it's on a sketchpad, then you've got to redraw the whole thing. So even just the ability to edit and kind of refine what you're doing, I mean, that can get out of hand too, especially if you start creating without any deadlines, this like I can constantly edit it and make it better.
Restraint has a value. Restraint and boundaries have value to creative stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so, because with this album I was like editing for quite a while, and I was like, okay, we're getting to the deadline here now. I was like, the label's like whenever you want to put it out. I mean, there's lead time with that because you have to have the art in and different aspects of it. But I made a false deadline for myself and said, or an imaginary one, and said, I'm going to be done by this date. And that doesn't mean I sat around and did nothing for 2 months and then I'm like, all right, it's the deadline. But I was like, I need to work towards that, and it'll be wherever it's at that point. Because I mean, I don't think I've put anything out. I don't think I've ever worked, I do a lot of recordings for other artists, and I don't think I've ever put anything out where I'm like, that was 100% perfect. And like everything, every note, every track on that was perfect. And, I'm 100% proud of everything on there. I mean, there's I've worked for clients, and there's stuff out there where I'm just like, yeah, that wasn't our best day. That's not the best track, but kind of like what we were talking about earlier. It's like, I got to do something, and I've got to do something for, my own health and just for my own being. But also like I need to put stuff out, because you're not going to get noticed. You're not going to get that gig. You're not going to get that next opportunity if you're just not creating anything. And, I spent a lot of time with young creatives and college students, and there's a lot of students who are locked in that I'm afraid of feedback. And it's real, man. Like I'm 44 now, and I have it too. So I'm dealing with like 18-year-old kids who are like, they don't know it. They can't articulate it. And they're not saying like, I'm afraid to put this out because people will say it's trash. And then that means I'm trash, but I still have that at 44. So I mean, and I'll probably have it when I'm 64, if I live that long. But you know, so this idea that like you got to put stuff out, and at some point you have to, even though there's endless edit undos or edit redo, there's got to be a stopping point.
No, and that was when I was working with Hasbro on the Magic stuff. I was terrified.
Yeah.
I'll just be honest. I was terrified because
Absolutely.
Magic has been around for 20, 30 years, whatever. There's so many artists that I look at and I'm like, I am nowhere near these people. And the
that's
other
what
side,
you tell yourself, right? That's what you tell yourself, right?
Constantly. So I'm like, I'm going to submit this,
Yeah.
and they're going to come back and say, "Oh yeah, I honestly thought it was a scam when they first reached out. I'm like, there's no chance.
You're right. If they ask me for a credit card, I'm out. If they ask me...
I looked up the woman who contacted me. I'm like, does she actually work for the company? This has got to be a scam because there's no way they would want me to do this stuff. And the only reason they did is because I had a portfolio that was up that somebody saw and said, "Oh, that's a good fit." So absolutely, you put the stuff out. And yes, again, the thing you reach for is if anybody responds, then you've been successful. Yeah, you don't want to spend, because if you do spend forever editing, you'll never release it, and then no one will ever know about it. It will never come out, and nothing creative is ever done. That's another thing. It's never finished. It's the best state that you can put it out in. Because you will, if you spent forever editing one track, when are you ever going to do the other ones? You're never going to get to them because you will spend forever and always find a new problem. Always. It's never going to end.
There was an old mentor of mine. His name was, and no joke, his name was George Jefferson. And when I worked at a studio, this was after college. I lived in DC for a while, and I worked in a bunch of different studios. I was doing recording. This is kind of before I went back to school and, you know, moved on with the teaching thing. And I was working at all these different recording studios, and I had one mentor. His name was George Jefferson. And this guy was like an old school cat. He would like book whole tours with just like a phone and a pencil. Like he would just call like, you know, impresarios and different, you know, clubs and venues, and basically just book a whole show for an artist. This was, of course, like in the 2000s. But, you know, his big thing is he had this like running joke, and he would do it all the time. He'd be like, well, you guys, you know, he would be talking about putting stuff out and the importance of like sharing what you're doing and sharing your process. And he would say something like, oh, well, you guys know about Eric Jones or whatever. And like half the room would be like, you know, just nod to like agree. You know how people like sometimes just like be like, oh yeah, Eric Jones.
Well, of course.
Like,
who doesn't know Eric Jones? Of course I do.
Yeah. Oh, Eric Jones, of course. And then the other half of the room would be like, who the hell's Eric Jones? And he'd be like, exactly. You don't know him because he never put anything out. And that's like such a like
that's a great bait and switch, man. That's a great way to do it.
But half the room would just like be clowned, you know. Everyone would just be like,
son of
ouch.
a bitch.
Yeah. And you know, I do that with my students, and they hate me. My students, all the dad jokes, and just they can't stand it. But I do that a lot with students. And you know, even one time in class I was like, now, you know, I did the not Ernest Hemingway, but who's The Importance of Being Earnest.
That's not Steinbeck. Who is that?
Well, no, it is. Actually, the quote is, no, the quote is, that's not, that's Oscar Wilde, but the quote is from John Steinbeck, and it is, now that you're done trying to be perfect, you can be good. And I remember I told that to a class, and I was like, all right, well, have you heard the John Steinbeck quote? And they like got their notebooks out. They never have notebooks, right? You know, they're always on their phones. But they were like, they were going to write it down. And they're like, great, what kind of, you know, pillar of wisdom are you going to drop on me? And I read that quote. I'm like, now that you're done trying to be perfect, you can be good. And they booed me. They would, and I love my students, and we have a great relationship, but they were just like, they hated that. And so I often find too, even, you know, generationally, but just like people in general and people who are doing creative things, there's this expectation that what I'm going to do, it has to be this perfect thing. And, you know, instead it's, you know, like my colleague, Dave Hurley, who's like from Boston, he's like a Boston guy. He's like, it's pretty good enough, you know? And he talks about that a lot, is it pretty good enough? And so I think that's just kind of my mantra. And I have to remind myself every day, just be like, don't obsess about this. Like you were saying, like after a certain time, it's like, okay, let's step away, because I'm starting to get really obsessive about this. Let me walk away. Because, you know, there's a threshold, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but you do have to finish stuff and put stuff out.
Yeah, and there's also always a tension between what's in your head and what you can get out. I always say there's a gulf between mind to paper. It's like on my website, I have that from mind to paper because there's always going to be a loss there. It's almost like lossless compression and non. Well, the thing from your idea to when you get it out, there is going to be some loss there, but that doesn't destroy the idea. In fact, in some ways, it could improve it. There could be, because the other thing, and this is musically, anything really, is the accidental improvement, something that seems like a mistake. And that's what I mean about I have to take a break from my work because I might come back to something that I got ready to destroy that layer. I'm like, nope, this is awful. I don't do that. I'm like, walk away from it. Come back and I'll be like, no, actually, it's not that it's terrible. I just need to modify it. The line just needs to be over here, and then it works. I get what I was sort of trying to do. I just didn't do it the way I thought in my head, and I modify it. I'm assuming that's music's. Do you do that too? Where you because you're saying you step
the
away,
necessary
come back,
pause, the stop and do something else. Stop.
But do
and
you
do
find that
something else.
you've had something where you did this piece, and when you stopped, you're like, "This, I'm trashing this," and then when you come back to it a day later, you're like, "Oh no, okay, no, this has potential. It's just got to get transformed."
Well, it's interesting. On the album, there's a track called Throwaway Culture, and it's sort of a kind of just a synth. It's the Juno, just multiple overdubs of the Juno. And it kind of has
Shall
this
I play it in the background as you talk? Would like to play it?
Sure,
There
yeah.
we go.
You can play
Let's
it.
see how bad this is. Okay, there it goes. No, I mean bad as in if it's actually possible to talk over it. But I actually wanted to do this is have you pick like 2 or 3 tracks and talk through the process.
I feel like I need to do like a really serious voice as I'm talking.
And now as we continue talking to Dr. Doug, we are going
feel
to play
the
in the
undulating
Throwaway
melodies.
Culture, track number 4 off the forthcoming Music for Billionaires, available Friday, October 13th at your better. What is there? Music stores anymore? Tower Records?
At Circuit City. At
Circuit City. Yeah. You'll get a huge receipt to prove you bought it. Don't worry about it.
Yes, Comp USA. There's still a few open.
I completely cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah. So like there's this like undulating part here at the start, right? And the idea is, so I wrote this, and I basically wrote this part and said to myself, okay, this is a great idea. Is it enough? And you probably have found this too, where you're just like, is this idea enough of an idea? And so basically, I stepped away from it for a while, right? And I worked on some other tracks on the album and worked on something else. And I came back, and you'll actually notice after about a fourth of the song, these other kind of like sampled kind of voices come in, and that's actually just the sample from track 2 in Corporate Responsibility Pledge. So in that track, when you hear those kind of opening sort of theme, that revisits, and it's pitched down, it's changed a little bit, but it's sort of revisited in this track. So I think sometimes this idea of like stepping away and coming back, sometimes you see that, how we said even our bad ideas, sometimes our bad ideas, we sort of come back, right. Or we draw on these bad ideas, and they're actually practice or they're leading us to this other maybe more useful thing or related. And that's kind of what happened with this Throwaway Culture, is that actually the idea from another track fit within it. So the whole album samples, but like this track even just like samples the sample that was sampled in another track. So it's like sampling Inception here or something like that. But yeah, that was from stopping, doing something else, walking away, coming back. You can hear it right now. Here's that sort of chirping from Corporate Responsibility Pledge.
I'm just going to let this play for a minute, just so people can hear it. And then there's a fade out button. I'll test that out because I've never tried that before. So we'll see what that does. But no, I gotta tell you, I'm always nervous listening to people's music because I don't want to then go on a show with them and be like, it was listenable.
Cool.
You try not to, because there's always the tonal giveaway in the voices. You can always kind of hear it when people are like, oh yeah, I found it fascinating. I know what that word means. One of those type of things. But
or it's the one word, like desperate, like immolation is the name of the track, and you're just like, cool.
I found it very, very sonically listenable.
Yeah.
What?
There's an old joke that there were some interesting sonorities you used and that you explored in that piece. That is the catch-all. I have no idea what the hell you're doing, man.
Oh, that worked really well. Okay. Yeah, so that was actually, this sort of leads into where I was going to go with it. Now, we won't play the whole album because we'll be here for an hour, but I wanted you, because I honestly, I thought this album man, again, it's one of those weird things where now it's like, oh, I have a whole bunch of new albums to listen to, because I love ambient music. I love it of all types, even stuff that would be defined as experimental, depending on it. And actually, because I never did ask that question properly, I realize. So for somebody who's only, and then we're going to get to the album, I promise. For somebody who's only, what's the word for it? Whose only conception of experimental is the pots and pans. Let's say somebody's only heard a couple of albums that are maybe not the most refined or wasn't to their taste. Who would you suggest? Give me 2 or 3 people that you'd say, okay, if you want to get into experimental, you want to see if this is for you, who would you listen to? Besides yourself, who else?
Oh, if you're really into like drone music, so I feel like there's ambient music and then the more experimental ambient music. So it's like really droney. It's really stripped down. There's a wonderful station. It's run out of San Francisco. So it's kind of in your neck of the woods. It's called Soma FM. And
I love Soma, man.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, they've got all the cool like deep space channels and all that, but they have a channel on there called Drone Zone. And my music has been played on there a bunch, especially like my first album, which was like a pure drone album.
I would bet I heard it and just never picked up on the fact that it was yours. I would bet anything.
Yeah. But that, to me, that's a great way for me to find out sort of like the canon, because there's like a lot of like classic tracks from the 90s in there. Even Groove Salad is another sub-channel on Soma FM, where there's a lot of this like great like kind of sort of ambient downbeat electronic music that maybe you might not know, but it gives you the 90s and the 2000s, like the canon or like the traditional ones, but then they'll always throw something new on there. And so for me, that's a great way to kind of curate, what I'm listening to and sort of, just kind of keep me sort of, fresh and, versus listening to like top 40 radio, which doesn't even really exist, or, I'm kind of bummed by some of the streaming services that have playlists, because, a lot of times, besides something like Beatport or something like that, where it's like, I really trust the curators, because they're practitioners as well.
Sure.
Sometimes the playlists are just these like taste setters that maybe aren't really interested in the same things that I am, which is just good stuff. And so check out Drone Zone. Like next time you're like stressed out, next time you're like I was talking about being at a 7, getting to the 10 meltdown. Like the next time you're at a 7, like throw the earbuds in, or, throw on some speakers or get in your car and just listen to the Drone Zone. Earlier in the day is like kind of more upbeat ambient drone music. Definitely like after 9 o'clock, it gets like sort of Hellraiser soundtrack. So just,
man, Hellraiser 2 is really such a great soundtrack.
Yeah.
Isn't
but if
it?
you're down and out and it's 9 o'clock at night, don't do the Drone Zone. It's just be like weird. You hear the chains, from like a Hellraiser, how there's like the chains in the background.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Christopher Young, I believe is the composer's name. That guy is awesome.
Yeah. Amazing stuff. But like, if you're trying to relax, maybe, I don't know. It puts you in a different place. Yeah. Yeah. But
yeah, there's a guy, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, called Harry, I'm probably mispronouncing it, Bertoia. And he did a whole collection where he used to work with these metal rods.
Yeah.
And do and it's really interesting stuff to listen to.
Yeah.
That's kind of something where if I'm trying to, it's literally, I call it like my mood breaker music. If I'm stuck in some type of thing, I listen to that. And it kind of just, it's so alien almost that it breaks me out of whatever it is and kind of resets me. It's great stuff.
Yeah. And that's the kind of like experimental that I really appreciate, that like maybe the means or the material are experimental. Like, hey, I'm just going to use these metal rods and like make an album. And I'm really drawn to that type of thing, that like the means are experimental, but sometimes the actual music could be pretty conventional, or, really tonal or comforting, or like you said, just like so kind of alien that it just like kind of gets me out of myself for a little while and I can kind of escape or like you said, reset.
Stellar Drone is another one I like space music. I always call it space. Yeah. Stellar Drone is
even
amazing.
What's the one where it's ambient music with the weather report, the San Francisco, or is it a police scanner?
Oh, I know what you mean. Yeah.
So good. Sometimes like that 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, you're like driving in the car at night, like that can just be That can be
I
good.
listen.
That can be
I
a good
listen
vibe.
to friggin' number stations sometimes, and I'm like, I just like to hear number stations with the static and the weird phrases. And I'm like, this is wonderful background music if I just want to kind of go into outer space for a while.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get to music for billionaires because I keep derailing everything when I try to get to it.
No, it's
So
okay. These are great
yeah,
questions.
pick for me two or we already talked about throwaway culture.
Sure.
So give me a couple of songs that and walk me through. I mean, you could do this from the conceptual part of the album too. If you want to explain what the concept of the album is, start with that, and then pick a couple of tracks and kind of walk through. Because let's assume that most people are like me and they have no idea how music like this is made, from literally the conceptual ideas to the physicality of how it goes through. So where did the album? Because I know you did a video with Corporate Responsibility Pledge, right? With I don't remember the artist's name. I don't remember what her name is.
Alison Tannenhouse. Wonderful like glitch artist. She refers to herself as a glitch artist. So she does a lot of stuff where it's like kind of like post advertising. She works in like advertising. She like writes jokes for like Subway for Patrick Mahomes, but when she's doing this other art, this other creative thing, she's like, it's almost like she's like repurposing all the commercials and ads that she does, and she sort of refocuses that into art. So as that's kind of like my idea for creating music too, is like taking these like source materials that maybe are known, maybe are copyrighted, but you know, taking them and sort of repurposing them into a lot of times something that we don't even interpret as the original anymore, but maybe still there's that weird, like, what is that sound? That reminds me of something, you know? And it's like, I don't know. It's like, not Terry the Tiger, who's actually for copyright, let's call it Terry the Tiger.
Sure.
From you know, sugar flakes or whatever,
so
right?
from a cereal that has a high sugar content.
Sugar content and flakes.
They're wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. I almost did the catchline. But even that, like, so the fact that you said, you know, they're wonderful, and then I knew exactly what the real tagline was. And so I think when you start using those advertising tropes, like when you start using that type of stuff, I think immediately, you know, as a listener, people are drawn to that. And even if it's really abstract, they're like drawn to all the marketing that we're just inundated with since, you know, we've been infants. So, so for this album though, I was like, so when I do that, it's often really abstract, and like Betty and the Sensory World and, Beast of Bode and Moore, my second album, and then Ambient Works, my third release, a lot of times it was just like you didn't know what the source material was, and it was very abstract. And that was exciting, and I enjoyed doing that. But this album was about, now how can I sort of bring this into another realm? And there's a friend of mine, Michael Drews. He's a composer and artist. And he has this like funny statement, and I think he just made it off the cuff to me one time, but he was like, you know, we can like make anything in our basement, but it's like, you know, like, how do we get it out of the basement? Like, how do we take this weird thing that we've made on our computer, right, and toiled over for years? Like, how do we get that out of the basement and get it to an audience, whether that's in a performance or, you know, on an album? And so I was like, okay, let me incorporate live instruments with what I'm doing. And the idea behind that is, let me get these really good musicians that can do, you know, really crazy, interesting stuff on their instruments. And that's not to say that I only ask them to do crazy things. I mean, there's, in the second track and even the third track. So the second track is Corporate Responsibility Pledge, and the third track is Burning Old Man Summer. And in a lot of those, there's both a really strong live instrumental part to that, to the other electronics or processing that's going on. And I'm not asking them to do like really crazy things. It's a lot of it's really conventional. But I think it just grounds like I can just make a 60-minute ambient drone album. Like I could like knock one out in a few weeks. Right. But I was like, I want to take those really abstract soundscapes and I want to sort of bring them into a more comfortable realm, this was chamber music. So anybody who listens to, you know, chamber music or classical music or string quartets or even jazz would have a point of reference for this.
I'm going to play Burning Old Man Summer as you talk. We'll go ahead and play it so people have a sense of it since you mentioned it. So I'm going to start that. Sorry, go on.
So, yeah, like especially with Burning Old Man Summer, I'm playing around with this idea of where some stuff is very specifically notated and other things are much freer. So even in this opening part here, it seems very kind of loose and sort of kind of ambient. It's because it's not explicitly written. There's notes and there's, sort of gestures that are written, but it's not giving you a specific timing. They do have to complete it in a certain, by a certain time in the piece, but when they play and how many times they play is not set. And then it does lock into a much more conventional, part, as you kind of hear here now, how it's like really sort of locking in.
And I would imagine these artists probably enjoy that too, right? To do something different, to be more, experimental would be the word, to kind of break out a little bit and do something that's a little looser.
Well, maybe that's, we were talking about defining experimental music. Like that's one of the ways I define it, is that it doesn't have to be this thing where it's really abstract and you have no point of reference. It could just be in the way you're notating it or the way you're asking musicians to perform. Could be an experiment, could be a test. And I've done this a couple times in a couple pieces, and on some pieces, I'm like, I didn't execute that quite right, or I didn't give the right directions. But I think in this piece, it works really beautifully. And of course, later on in the piece, it's just the live instruments. And so there's this big contrast between sort of the effects and the electronics, and then just the wonderful Hypercube ensemble that are known in New York for just being this very experimental and very, just this really exacting performance of kind of really difficult experimental music.
Now, are you playing on this particular track? Are you playing on every track, or is it more of you're giving the direction of the notes to others? How does it work for something like this?
Yeah. So for this, it's like definitely for Corporate Responsibility Pledge and this track, Burning Old Man Summer, it is written out note by note. And like I said, there's those sort of aleatoric or open sections. Brian Eno used to do that a lot too with aleatory and just having like kind of open or non-written parts. But for most of it, it's very specific. Do this at this point, and this sound effect's going to happen while you're playing this part of the instrument.
Man, that fade out. Sorry, I'm geeking out over the fact that this tool that I've never used before is working the way I actually intended it to, and not, destroying the recording somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so are these people, because with the other albums you've done, these are people I assume you have a working relationship, or were some of these people brand new to the process?
So I think what happened is I did, over pandemic, there was an opportunity to work with Allison and work with the Unheard of Ensemble, which you hear on Corporate Responsibility Pledge. And they were doing this like call for like media plus their ensemble. So I wrote a piece. I think that was like, I had done all these like ambient albums and these kind of like really just electronic albums. And here I was now writing a piece that was probably, I hadn't really written a piece like that since college. Like when I was writing for like clarinets. You probably remember in the dorm room, you're like, this one piece, I remember you called it like High Noon because it sounded like the clarinet or like the horn part from High Noon. And so like,
I gotta say as an aside, I always loved hearing that stuff because like I said, I music to me is one of these things where I can't ever, over time, I used to play the drums. That's the closest I've ever been to being a musician at all. But there's all these times, like most people, I'm sitting here going, oh, I'd love to write something. And I've messed around with tools. I'm like, yeah, I do not have the head for this at all. So it's always interesting when I hear people, because that was a rare gift, was to share a room with somebody like you who I could hear what you were working on. And I think too, it was, again, this is kind of with the offcuts thing. It's beneficial to understand that these things don't come out fully formed. There is a process. There are failures. There are adjustments because I think we all do that. We think, the people who we are familiar with, they just make a song. They just, I just dreamed it up. They play it on a piano and Elton John bangs it out in 2 days. And that's not the reality. At some point when you do it long enough, maybe, but that's a long process to get there.
It's a toil. It's horrible. And that's what I was saying about being connected to just other artists, like people who are drawing or sculpting, in college, because you're just like, oh no, they're suffering too. Like everyone's here suffering. So, later at night when we'd be all at a party together or just like hanging out in the quad, like, it was like, oh no, we all were suffering today, toiling, working on this. Maybe we had some setbacks, maybe we made some progress, but that was like our time to unwind. And I think that camaraderie, like you don't always have that. You know, I have it sometimes, you know, teaching with colleagues who are also creatives or, you know, just other art communities here in Boston. But yeah, like, you know, we talk about, you know, college kind of being throwaway sometimes or having some issues about its merits. But I definitely think one positive thing we can say is that if you're in a community with people who are like-minded or doing they could be from different diverse backgrounds, but they're like all engaged in the same thing, whether that be like painting or music, there becomes this commonality. And, you know, it's like, you know, it's all about like suffering. And if you can talk to other people about that suffering, then it's like, you're like, you'll keep going, or you're more likely to, you know, push through it and say, okay, let's get this thing done. Let's put this thing out.
I don't know if you remember this, but because I was a terrible student, I was not a good student. I didn't go to classes a lot. I was horrible, a terrible student. And so my senior project was due, and I only had half. It was supposed to be all these pieces, large scale pieces that had to be done. And I only, I think out of the 12 I did, I only had maybe 5 done the night before. And I stayed up on caffeine and just pure desperation, cranking all this stuff out. And got them done enough to actually get the project done. But I remember you had to display them. And I in that room with other people, many of whom were better and more dedicated, we'll say it like that were actually doing the work the proper way. And I thought these people must look at me and they're like, this lazy piece of shit shows up and he's going to get his project done. And he didn't put in a half of the effort I did. And that's what I thought. But also they said, the teacher said, put a little book near your stuff so people can write in it. And I wrote in people's stuff because, like I said, some of these people were just unbelievable. Yeah. And then, but I didn't really look at mine. And then after it was over, I took the book. I didn't even look at it because I'm like, it's probably empty or it's going to be, you know, good job for my mom and dad or something like that. And that's all.
Right.
And there were pages where these people were like, we're really glad that you were able to complete everything. It looks really good. And I was so stunned by that. And it's exactly what you're talking about. Because they could have just ignored it. Obviously, like I said, I was clearly not as committed, or at least I wasn't doing it. I was not putting my full effort into it. I'll just say it honestly. It's what it was. And they could have just ignored me or, you know, or said something like, well, it's a miracle you got it done type of thing. And they didn't. They were very supportive. It was really amazing.
Because you finished. I think that's the thing. I feel like it's like you played the game. You didn't win, but you played the game. And I feel like I always admire that. You know, it's like somebody was able to take this thing and finish it. And that's not easy. Yeah. Because you're fighting yourself, you're fighting everybody else, you know, you're fighting your own time, your own procrastination. And you know, one of the things I always appreciated too, your art was always so linked to the computer and using computers. And, you know, that's one thing that I always really admired about what you were doing is that I was like, oh no, like art is made with a computer. And, you know, kind of for the album, you asked me like, are you playing on this? Are you playing an instrument? And I almost got into the philosophical thing, like the computer is an instrument, you know, blah, blah, blah. But like, but that was something, you know, definitely I learned at college and just being part of these communities and even just seeing like yourself, like other artists, like you know, working in Photoshop and working in these other programs, just as much as you were, you know, painting or drawing. But you know, that the computer can be a gateway and can be a very powerful tool, just like a brush or, you know, an instrument in the, you know, like a violin versus, you know, a push or some other, you know, DAW software like Ableton Live.
Well, yeah, and there is, I feel like sometimes a prejudice against, you know, using a computer to do something. It's less now, but it certainly was for a while where people were like, well, if you did it on a computer, you weren't doing it. And I'm sitting here going, and don't get me wrong, I was never this enlightened when I was younger, but as I've gotten older, I'm sitting here going, yeah, but that assumes that everybody can play an instrument. What if you have a mobility problem? What if you have a vision problem or something, and that computer allows you to express something? Then who cares what avenue it is?
See, I don't even let people off the hook. I'm like, the computer is an instrument, dude. Like, come on, man. Like, I've got my leather jacket on and my smokes rolled up in my sleeves, right? I'm like, what are you talking about, man? The computer is an instrument.
I'm not hearing that jive, man. That's not what it's about. You know, if you want to be a square and sit over there with your banjo, go for it, baby, because I'm on here, and this MacBook Pro is every bit as much of an instrument as I'm going to pluck it the same way you pluck that banjo. keep talking to me, I'm going to shove it up there anyway. So, all right. So, all right, let's do 2 more tracks because we're kind of getting, towards the end here. So pick 2 more tracks that you want to talk about. I'll play them and I'll let you talk over them.
Great.
So we did what? We've done Throwaway Culture. We did Burning Old Man Summer.
Let's do the last track. Let's do the CRP East Coast remix.
All right. Let me get that queued up, as they say in the biz. I don't know what biz that is, but I'm going to pretend I do. And I'll start it. And let's talk about CRP East Coast Remix, the final track on Music for Billionaires, available Friday, October 13th at your local Circuit City.
Yeah, I'll let you listen to it a little bit here, but you can tell this is kind of some of the same material from Corporate Responsibility Pledge, remixed. So let's listen to a little bit of it.
I love that transition, by the way, just so I could chime in. I think that's great.
Yeah. So maybe we could fade it out there. This track is basically, it is a remix of Corporate Responsibility Pledge. And it was like one of those things we talked about, like taking a step away, like walking away and coming back. And originally there was going to be another track that was going to be the final track on the album. And it just, it was one of those things like with open notation I was talking about earlier, like it just didn't quite work out and the performance wasn't quite what I wanted. So I was like, you know what, let me do this post-consumerism, post-capitalism idea of the remix, right? Or the reboot. And I'm like, that goes in with this whole vibe of the album, this idea of like this content, this consumer product that's like sort of being reused or manipulated. And so that's what, CRP East Coast Remix is. I wanted to say like featuring somebody or something like that, but I probably could have got Snoop Dogg. I think he charges like, what is it, $250,000 to be featured on a track, but I didn't have that type of money.
And would have been worth every penny, because man, that dude, there's nothing he doesn't do well. I love that guy.
It would be if I had $250,000 lying around, yeah, absolutely. But I don't. So it was this idea of what if I took something and made something very straightforward. And I feel like this song is the most sort of conventional. There's a beat, there's drops, there's transitions that you can really latch on to. So, maybe where like the first track is this really ambient kind of stuff that I've done in the past. I think the album shows sort of a transition from this sort of really ambient to this very instrument driven music to now where I'm really just manipulating the original performances and making something a little bit more conventional. And, some people might be like, well, this isn't experimental anymore, or this isn't this and that. And, well, who cares? Who cares? I mean, if you're enjoying it, if you think it fits the content of the rest of the album or the context of the rest of the album too, then let's put it on there. Let's do it. I think there's a lot of like, you pick a label because they do a certain genre or they have certain audiences. And I think that's important. But at the same time, like for me at least, I'm like, I want to follow the things that I'm interested in, that I'm drawn to. So, earlier we were talking about pots and pans don't really do it for me. I'm not going to discount that or discredit that, but I'm going to move towards the things that are interest and resonate to me. Because like you said, hopefully whether it's on SoundCloud, Bandcamp, or wherever, somebody else is going to hear that. It's going to resonate with them. And then it just moves forward from there. Maybe they just enjoy it and have a good time. Maybe it turns into a gig. Maybe they're just not pissed off for the 7 minutes that they listen to it. And they enjoy themselves.
Well, the other nice part about it being experimental is experimental means it can be so many things. It doesn't have to be. So somebody's saying, well, that's not experimental. According to what definition do you know what experimental means?
It's kind of like a cop-out. You can just be like, it's experimental. So, yeah.
Well, but it's great because it does free up. And I like the idea of stuff like that. And even when it comes to any medium can do this, because you go into like a David Lynch film, and that would be many times it's an experimental film, and people will be like, why is this scene going on for 20 minutes? It's like, no, it's not about conveying a conventional narrative. The idea is, what is the response? What is the feeling that you get? That type of thing.
Yeah, and David Lynch is just the master.
Is he the best of what?
The rope-a-dope. So he'll sit there for 20 minutes, and you're like, these are just normal people having a normal conversation. And then all of a sudden, there's somebody with a gas mask.
A goblin comes off from the corner and goes, ah! And it's like, what the hell does that mean?
So, yeah, and it's like, he justifies it within the world, this like transcendental meditation and just all, his sort of creative world. But yeah, like that's the cool thing about experimental too, is like sometimes if you come onto the stage, like from a musical perspective, if the musician comes on with a tuxedo on and sits down in front of the piano and begins to play this like piano concerto or just this like piano sonata, you're just like, oh, okay. And I feel like that's the David Lynch film. You're like, oh, okay, it's somebody playing a piano sonata. It's not really my thing, but okay. And then like you said, halfway through the performance, a goblin jumps out of the piano, or it gets really crazy musically. It goes in this other direction. So I love that idea of like wolf in a sheep's clothing idea of having something that seems very conventional, but at the same time is really sort of pushing some boundaries.
Well, I think we're probably in a good position to wrap up here. So before I do my little outro thing, is there anything else you wanted to plug besides Music for Billionaires?
No, just check out Music for Billionaires. It's coming out October 13th, Friday the 13th on New Focus Recordings. And please check it out. It'll be on all the streaming platforms as well as on Bandcamp to download.
Okay, well, let me do this. Well, first of all, Doug, thanks for this. Has been a blast, man. I mean, this is exactly. Mm-hmm. I've said this every time I do one of these. I'm going to keep saying it because it's always true. I'm always expecting one of these to go horribly wrong, and it never happens. It's never happened
yet.
Nope, not yet. So I'm just going to keep rolling the dice, and maybe it'll keep coming up whatever craps it's supposed to come up with, because I've never actually played it, but I know there's dice involved. Yeah. So whatever that's supposed to be, I'll keep rolling it and hoping it comes up that way. So thanks for doing this, man, because it's just been it's been a blast. It really has been a lot of fun. Everybody else, I'm going to remind you to go to DougBielmeier.com. And, of course, be sure to check out Music for Billionaires. And I will probably plug something on my shorter shows when that comes out to remind people. And as far as our show, not that it's going to necessarily live up to the quality of that album, but you can listen to past episodes of our shows by going over to ozonenightmare.com, clicking on the podcast link. Absolutely let me know how you enjoyed our conversation. As I always say, it's all about me, and I had a great time. So I hope you did too, but if you didn't, at least I did. And we appreciate everybody listening, and we will talk to you on the next episode. So take care, everybody. Visit ozonenightmare.com to subscribe to new episodes, browse through our back catalog, or find links to support the show. Follow @OzoneNightmare on Twitter for the latest episode postings and other show information. If 280 characters just isn't enough, you can always email us, theozonenightmare@gmail.com. Music for Ozone Late Night is provided by Ogre. Visit ogresound.bandcamp.com to listen to and purchase his fantastic selection of music.